pockets of history because she bits that she's drawn to, she knows an awful lot about, and an awful lot more than I do. Like, I never knew the background of Nichols. I had some idea of him as a professional, but things like him losing his ship and the implications of that, and the fact that he came from the right family, saved them and all that. So the piece you do that is great, and of course, trying to trace our people of Portumna is very hard. Like, you know, Barbara will tell you, it's not easy to trace people. You need to get awful lucky, and you need to. But we have been looking for Portumna, and the funny thing is, names in Portumna, like my surname is Joel, and it's a big name where I'm from. We had a Madden gathering, but there's a name called Aberton, which I presume none of you have ever heard of. I never heard the name until I went up to Portumna, and it's a massive name in Portumna. And so it's easy for us then to trace into the families. And I think things like this will get easier with DNA as well, because they know little nuggets that maybe they're uncomfortable sharing. And maybe there was a shame about having family in the workhouse one time. Please God, we're living in a more enlightened time now. But Aileen, no doubt.
Hello everybody, thank you Steve for your wonderful talk there. So today obviously I'm going to speak about daily life in the workhouse. But just before I do, I'm going to do a small little bit of background as to how did workhouses come about in the first place. So in the 19th century there were numerous inquiries set up, as you probably can imagine, like today, inquiry after inquiry and very little done about it. The one that kind of held any weight was the 1833 Poor Inquiry that was set up under the chairmanship of Richard Whately, Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin. Now, it was officially called the Royal Commission for Inquiring into the Condition of the Poorer Classes in Ireland. It actually found that the poor system as it had applied in England was unsuitable for Ireland, because in Ireland there were able-bodied that were more willing to accept the work that came their way. However, Lord John Russell, who some of you might remember actually became Prime Minister during the Great Hunger, at the time was Secretary of State for the Home Department, and he felt that the Commission had overstepped their brief. Basically, they had stepped out of line. And he decided to send George Nichols, who Steve talked about there a little bit, to investigate the situation. Now, he was to assess whether a system based on poor relief, funded by the local poor rate, would be effective in Ireland. And he was also to find out whether the workhouse system could be established in Ireland. And guess what? That's exactly what he recommended. So, because of Nichols' recommendation that they adopt the English system, in 1837 a bill was introduced to Parliament, and that bill was later to become the Act for the Effectual Relief of the Destitute Poor in Ireland in July 1838, Poor Law Act of 1838. So here we have the three main people involved in that process: the Archbishop, Lord John Russell, and George Nichols himself. So as I said, the Poor Law Act was passed in 1838. 130 workhouses initially were built. 33 were to follow in the wake of the Great Hunger. So George Wilkinson, our architect that Steve also spoke a little bit about, he was a 24-year-old engineer from Oxfordshire in the UK. And he was tasked with designing and overseeing the construction of the workhouses. Now, he had come from a family of builder architects, and they were quite friendly with the Nichols family. So it was actually on George Nichols' recommendation that George Wilkinson was appointed as the architect. So here we have a drawing of one of Wilkinson's designs for the workhouse. And you can see on the right here, that's Parsonstown or Burr Workhouse, and you can see it is pretty much exactly as what he came up with in his drawing. Now, he was given instructions by the Poor Law Commission, and he was told that the style of building is to be of the cheapest description compatible with durability, and effect is aimed at by harmony of proportion and simplicity of arrangement, all mere decoration being studiously excluded. So they were to be plain and simple and functional. So entry to the poorhouse was only given to those who were in dire need. They had to be destitutely poor and having absolutely no means whatsoever. And of course we also had the addition of the Gregory Clause, which stated that anybody who owned more than a quarter acre of land would not be entitled to any poor relief whatsoever. So people who were elderly, ill, disabled, or had no family willing to take or able to take care of them also would turn to the workhouse for help. There was nowhere else to go. It was a place of absolute last resort. You didn't go to the workhouse unless you absolutely had to. There was a huge stigma attached to it, and also the fear, of course, of death and disease. So on presenting themselves to the workhouse, people could go no further than the first room. And if you've been to our workhouse in Portumna, will know that's just inside the green doors, that very, very first room. That's what we call the waiting hall. And they had to wait there to be seen by either the master, mainly the master, if he wasn't available though the matron would do, who would inspect them and would decide whether they were poor enough to be admitted. And they had final say on this. From this point, separation started. They first separated the males from the females. They sent them to two separate, what they call probation wards. In the probation ward, they got a bath. Now, a bath consisted of being put into a big tin bath full of water that could have been there for days or even weeks. After they were bathed, they were given a uniform to wear. Very coarse, plain. You can see the bath here. These are children that's actually from an English workhouse, Southall. And you can see that they were basically clothed in whatever material was available, sacking a lot of the time. In Ireland, of course, during the Great Hunger, there was no such thing. You stayed in your rags because there was nothing else to give them. From that point then, they were separated even further, as in the adults were separated from the children. They separated them by age. So adults were deemed to be aged 15 years and older. And under 15, between 2 and 15, there were boys and girls, there were children. Under 2s were kept with their mother. I assume the only reason that was that the mother was feeding them. So, had to be kept with their mother. But of course, once they reached 2 then, they were taken from her and put in with either the boys or the girls, depending on which they were. Here we have an aerial picture of Portumna Workhouse. And I've just put in little labels there to show you have women and girls on the left, and men and boys on the right. So, the daily routine, as you can imagine, not very exciting. They rose at 6 in the summertime, 7 in the winter. They went for their breakfast, they went to work, they went to dinner, they went to work, they had supper, they went to bed. That was the day. It was designed to be monotonous and boring. Work being the most important part of the day, because the thinking in the Poor Law Commissioner's thinking was that if paupers were made to work as opposed to being given handouts, then they would work harder to fend for themselves and not rely on this relief that was being given in the workhouses. So daily life for adults and children kind of varied a small bit, as in adults had harder work to do than the children, and children had a form of education, but I'll touch on that a little bit later on. So, yes, here we are. So, mealtime obviously was very important for the inmates. Mealtime in Irish workhouses was not the most exciting thing in the world. Stirabout formed a major part of the diet. And what's stirabout? Basically porridge. Thin, watery, gruel, Dickens would have described it as. It was often reported as being very poor, with inmates reporting that they simply could not eat it, and that those who did consume it became very ill. In Portumna Workhouse in 1864, the Poor Law Commissioners launched an investigation into the diet. An inmate called Jody Solon testified that the bread was always blue moulded and musty. The Nation newspaper carried the story, and they noted that on one occasion 200 rations of objectionable food was so bad that it was thrown out into the cesspit. A woman named Mrs. Callaghy offered to buy the food to give to her pigs, and her offer was rejected, saying that even the pigs couldn't consume this food. A man called John Howard, whose leg ulcers were so bad that he had to be carried in to give evidence into the boardroom, stated that the food made him so thirsty he was forced to drink his own urine. Very nice. Here we have the prescribed diet and meal and what they were supposed to get in the workhouse. But as we know, the reality was very, very different. Now, in the workhouses before and after the Great Hunger, there actually was a meal called supper for adults, but during the Great Hunger, that was completely discontinued. And as you can see, they gave the children slightly a bit more, supposed to give them a better chance, but what chance did they really have? So, after this investigation of Portumna in 1864, the master of the time, who was called Henry Ogle, and if anyone keeps an eye on our Facebook and our website, you might see that Henry Ogle has been investigated by one of my colleagues. Very interesting story. If you have time, check it out. And he was found to not officially be negligent at all. The commissioners were unhappy with the food, but basically it wasn't his fault. So unions were allowed to request changes to this prescribed diet, but that request was hugely ignored. In the 1860s, they proposed to provide inmates with a fork, a knife and a spoon. In the 1860s. So up to the 1860s, who knows, maybe they were just eating with their hands or putting the bowl up to their mouth. They had no utensils whatsoever. So they did make a few more improvements in the 1890s. They introduced things like butter, tea and coffee. Boiled beef, bread, dumplings and vegetables were added. But there remained very little inconsistency. And in terms of quality, there just wasn't the quality wasn't there. It was basically a thin watery soup they were getting. So here we have an image of what store-bought, how we imagine it kind of looked like. It could also be let dry and set and hardened into what looked like a loaf of bread. And you have a recipe there. So you can imagine that this stuff was not nice at all. A description in the Freeman's Journal here you can see from 1864 stated that it was as hard as a flag, compared to nothing but a fragment of granite containing copper, and that no matter how hard you tried to chew this thing, there was no way you could actually chew it in order to digest it. So here we have what they might have gotten around the 1890s, a few potatoes, a bit of meat, a bit of bread. It doesn't look very appetising. So, workhouse. Workhouse. You have to work. That's the whole idea. So what kind of work did they do? Well, the women were tasked with cleaning, domestic duties, kitchen duties, laundry, spinning yarn, and sewing and mending of uniforms. I know in our workhouse we have an actual whole building dedicated to the laundry side of things. We know that they did spinning of yarn in Portumna Workhouse as well. It was a major thing, and here you can see they're very industrialised, these people, very institutionalised. They're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. It wasn't much better for the men. They were tasked with things like stone breaking, corn grinding, bone crushing. Bone crushing was an interesting one. They actually discontinued doing it. But Steve mentioned, who do you think you are? Mary Berry, you might know her from British Bake Off, yes indeed. Did the programme, found out that her great-grandfather, I believe, was a baker in Norwich in the UK. And he won the contract to provide the workhouse in Norwich with bread. And they eventually found out, through the complaints of the inmates, that this bread was disgusting, it was horrible, that he had been cutting the flour with ground up bones in order to stretch it out to make the 700 loaves of bread a day that were required by the workhouse. So you can think of things like fairy tales often have echoes of real life. So fee fi fo fum, I'll grind his bones to make my bread, the blood of the Englishman. You can kind of understand where that story came from. I have in red at the bottom here oakum picking. Oakum picking was a major part of the work in the workhouse. And not many people know what it means. I didn't myself until I came to Portumna Workhouse. And here we have a picture of women. There were large hemp ropes that they had to tear apart into their single fibres, as it were. Those fibres would then be sold to the shipyards, they would be mixed with tar, they would be used to caulk the ships. Very, very tedious and painful work, because these ropes were really hard. They had to use their bare hands to do it. Now they would be given a nail to try and scrape apart the rope, try to scrape the tar that had been already on it. But they found it was quicker to use their bare fingers, because they would be given a lump of rope and told, you have to have that much unravelled by such a time or you don't get fed. So they ended up with calluses, with scars on their fingers. The tops of their fingers would be black from all the scarring. Again, not very pretty. So then, at the end of a very long, hard day, they went to bed. And these two photographs are of our dormitories in Portumna. Now, the dormitories were very simple, as you can see. They slept on platforms, raised up platforms, on straw mattresses. Very simple, not very comfortable. When we have school tours in Portumna, the children love to test out the mattresses. We do ask them would they like to spend the night. And some of them get brave and say, oh yeah, I'd love to, that'd be grand, yeah. And when they're told they can't bring their PlayStation with them, it's a different story. As you can see in the dormitories, all the walls were whitewashed. And the reason for that was twofold. One was that whitewash has antiseptic properties in it, so they were trying some sort of disease control. And the other was going back to work. One of the forms of work was to paint the walls. Now, I believe Steve found at one point that they painted the walls in Portumna Workhouse 27 times in 1 year. Once a fortnight. Yeah, so again, boring, tedious. It didn't really matter to the Poor Law Commission what work they were doing, as long as they were doing something. They couldn't be seen to be idle in the workhouse. So the keys of the workhouse were held during the day by the porter, and it was, per the regulations, his duty to lock all the outer doors and take the keys to the master at 9 p.m. every night and to receive them back from him in the morning so he could go around opening everything up again. 8 p.m. was sleep time, and at this time the inmates were expected to get ready for bed and be in bed when the staff member in charge of whatever particular block they were sleeping in could inspect them at around 8:15. I have a quote here from a workhouse inmate who said, "Up we go to the dormitories at 7:45. 10 minutes or so are occupied in changing underclothing and getting between the sheets." Now, in Irish workhouses, sheets were few and far between, I can assure you. The labour master goes on his round and sees that all is right. By 8:15, the latest, all of the doors are locked. All lights, save that for the recently introduced night lamps, are extinguished, and the men are left to themselves for 11 long hours. So the workhouse was not a prison, even though people were called inmates and they were issued with uniforms. It wasn't a prison, they could leave if they wanted to leave. However, they were locked in at night. And we assume the reason they were locked in at night was to prevent them from causing trouble, going around trying to steal some food, attacking the staff in their beds because they were horrible, and even meeting up with each other. They didn't want families to ever interact with each other. So, oh yeah, I did mention the education for the children in the workhouse. It was very scant. It was prescribed that they received 3 hours a day, but that rarely happened. They were to appoint a schoolmaster and a schoolmistress, but however, these people were sometimes not even qualified. We had come across a tale, I think it's carried across Workhouse, where they had to fire the schoolmistress because after a time, they found she was illiterate. She to teach the children in the workhouse. But I suppose if you're that desperate for a job, you'll say anything. So in 1916 in Ballinasloe Workhouse, now by the early 20th century, children in workhouses were very scarce. They wouldn't have that many children in the workhouses because they would actually be sent to the industrial schools. So in Ballinasloe in 1916, I hereby give notice that in the event of the schoolmaster being elected to the position of master, so the schoolmaster was made the actual master of the workhouse, I move that on this day the position of schoolmaster be abolished and that the schoolboys either be sent to the outside school or boarded out, and so save £90 to £100 a year. So as Steve was saying, money, that was the bottom line. It was all about the money. So yes, after the workhouses were abolished, as Steve said, some became hospitals, and here we have the example of a very good building that survives in Loughrea, St Brendan's nursing home. So yeah, as Steve said, there was ways out of the workhouse. One could emigrate. If you're very lucky, you might get a job. But for the main, life in the workhouse was dreary, was monotonous, but it was a means to an end. At least a number of people survived where they wouldn't have survived without the workhouse.